Here is Brazil. You know, we're all like ripped up about our politics, the fact that we might be facing, probably will be facing another Biden-Trump showdown in the general. It's old hat for the Brazilians. They've already done it twice. And their candidates, one guy was campaigning from prison where he had been convicted of corruption, not indicted, convicted. And the other guy said that the real problem with those Nazis is they were just way too soft on their domestic opponents. The Nazi won the first round. The guy in prison ran the second time. I'd argue that Brazil has already entered the first of 2 decades of lost time. Here's India. Prime Minister Modi adopted something very similar to what the Australians did, but you only got the money if you were one of his friends. And here are the Chinese. Let me adjust this for you. Are you kidding me? How anyone thinks that China is a serious player on the international playground is beyond me. We are looking at the equivalent of Enron in the 11th hour. The question is, when it falls, what does it do? I'm not really worried about it from a strategic point of view. They can't really reach anyone. I'd be a little nervous if I was Taiwan, obviously. But I'm more worried about the economic consequences, and we're starting to see the kind of faint outlines of what that's going to look like. So good and bad. Let's start with the good. I'm not worried about finance. And that's courtesy, ironically, of the Russians. When the Ukraine war started, every Western financial institution cut their exposure to Russian banks to zero. The Chinese flooded into the space to take over. And that meant that every Western institution was like, whoa, that's like screaming for sanctions. We should probably cut our connections to the Chinese as well. And here we are, a year and a half into the war, and the total exposure of all Western banks to all Chinese banks is less than 1% of their global holdings. That's a happy circumstance. I like that. I'm also not worried about merchandise exports to the Chinese because it's a very protectionist system. They build anything they possibly can. They import as little as they can, which means that the total exposure, the entire world, to the Chinese consumer is only about 3.5% of Chinese GDP, which is the lowest goods exposure of any country today. It's not zero, but it's manageable. If you're in the world of commodities, different situation. It's investment driven, building things that they don't need. So whether it's copper or steel or aluminum, they are the world's largest player, often the world's largest importer. And even if we have to rebuild a lot of industrial plant in other places, the industrial plant we build in other places is going to be based on economics and efficiency rather than just build. We're not going to need as much. And so those sectors are going to have some serious downward adjustments. Food's kind of in the middle. The Chinese are the world's largest importer of almost every food product. Their diet has expanded massively in the last 35 years. And that is probably going to break down, but consider this. The last thing a government does before it collapses is somehow take steps to restrict the population's access to food. So of the things that are going to break, it's probably the last one to go, and it'll be a little bit of a softer landing because, we still need food. Tech's going to be an issue. The Chinese are not technically advanced. Most of what they do in manufacturing is relatively low value. And they bring in tech from everyone they can to build that industrial plant. And in terms of tech supply chains, they tend to be on the assembly side of things, with more advanced stuff coming from Taiwan, Thailand, Korea, and the rest. That whole ecosystem is going to end. And there aren't enough fingers and eyes in the world to do assembly on the scale we've become used to. And that's going to probably be what hurts us most of all. This is a document from the American Enterprise Institute on inflation. The yellow arrows are the average inflation since the year 2000, so roughly a 75% increase in inflation over the 22 years. Everything that is below that line has gotten cheaper. Everything above that line has gotten more expensive. Oversimplifying here, but above the line, those are the things that require fingers and eyes. Healthcare, for example, requires people. There's no way around that. And everything below it is something you plug into the wall that beeps and whirs, something that's manufactured. And the Chinese are a critical component of all of that. The biggest hole we're going to have when the Chinese go is the complex supply chains in the world of electronics is going to have to find a new way to put things together. And we haven't developed a new model for that in 60 years, and we're going to have to. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be a disaster, because one of the many things we found out about COVID is that the technology that we've had in pocket for years suddenly can be used at scale. I think the best example I can give you is textiles. Back before NAFTA, most of our textile processing was in places like Kentucky, where it was done by hand. And then NAFTA happened, and it all moved to Mexico because it was cheaper. And then the WTO happened, and it all moved to China and India because it was cheaper. But with COVID, it just stopped coming. And we still wanted clothes, so we had to figure out a different method. And we discovered that if you build a 2-acre facility that's automated, with a staff of 2, 1 software engineer, 1 mechanic, that one facility could produce finished clothes at a lower cost per garment than 200 seamstresses in Bangladesh. You bring in the cotton, the machines turn it into thread, turn it into yarn, turn it into cloth, cut it into clothes, assemble it, even do some of the finishing. We would have never known that before 2020. Hopefully, we will figure things like that out in other sectors. But that means we need a lot of investment in an era of constrained capital in order to happen at scale in every single manufacturing sector. We've started. The blue line is what happened with the shale sector. About 2012, that is when the majority of the natural gas consumed on this continent came from shale. A lot of that's waste gas. And so we tripled our investment in a couple years, and it hasn't fallen back. The refining sector, the chemicals sector, all expanding very quickly. It's actually the biggest build we've seen ever in the history of the country, faster than World War II. The gray bar is kind of the everything else category, and it's sliding up. You'll notice that in the last couple of years, it's picked up quite a bit. This is where we're all noticing it, though. This is electronics and computing. Now, a lot of people are like, isn't this all the IRA and the CHIPS Act? And that's some of it. Can I even get back here? Yeah. Okay. This spot right here, that's where the CHIPS Act and the IRA were passed. So all of this happened before. The industrial base is expanding significantly. But we need that kind of jack up for absolutely everything. There will be winners and losers. There's no way around that. On the high end, if you want a semiconductor fab facility, you need a lot of people in their 20s and 30s who are really clever. And the greatest concentration of those people in the country is the Colorado Front Range and the Arizona Sun Corridor. I know everybody thinks about Arizona and they think old people. They do have a lot of old people in Arizona. However, they're all white. Arizona actually has a very healthy demography. It doesn't have a labor shortage. It has a bilingual training problem. Different problem. And so you're seeing these areas pick up most of the investment for that because they've got a lot of green space. It's not taking over farms, so the land is cheap. And most of the people who move in are in their 20s and their 30s, and they tend to be very highly educated. That's where the concentration of labor for that sector happens to be, and policy is matching. You want to do automotive, you're looking at either the Great Lake regions or the South. Now, the Great Lake regions is all unionized. And so everything that has to do with internal combustion engines is going there. And we've seen that expand massively. Pros and cons. Pros, there's a lot of industrial plant there. You can rehabilitate a lot of the brown space. It's actually a relatively light carry from an investment point of view. The downside is they're not moving into any of the new stuff. And they probably